name is Adam Golub, Marketing and Communications Manager at Data Conversion Laboratory, and I will be your moderator today. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know we will allow time at the end of the webinar for questions and answers. So please write your questions in the chat area as they come to mind. If we don't have time to answer them all, we will make them available on our website. Next slide, please. For those of you who are not familiar with DCL, we convert and organize content to create electronic documents, populate databases, publish on the web, and basically get it ready for tomorrow's technology. Next slide, please. DCL services help you refine your document conversion strategy, identify document redundancy, extract metadata, and transform legacy and future documents for real needs, today and in the future. Next slide, please. DCL serves a broad client base spanning all industries. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Today we are thrilled to introduce Barry Schaefer of Content Lifecycle Consulting. Barry has designed authoring and provider support environments of all sizes for more than 20 years, dealing with provider challenges across a wide range of information areas in both public and private sectors. Without further ado, welcome Barry Schaefer.
Thanks, Adam, and thanks for coming by. I want to talk about providers today, and I think that's appropriate in today's world, and it's becoming more so as our information world broadens. What we can deliver broadens, the channels and the media that we have available broadens, and that, by definition, broadens the definition of who is a provider, what groups are we going to be getting information from, what do we need in order to be able to deliver that, and as the subtitle here says, why should we care? It's a truism, but I think one that we need to keep in mind, and that is that the provider groups that we work with are the raw material for everything that we deliver. It's not likely that we'll be producing products without some kind of source material, and for that, in vast majority of the cases, we're going to be going to a group of providers who may or may not have worked with systems or even with the internet before. Providers may be located anywhere in the world, and that has its own set of challenges. Last project I worked on had providers literally all over the world, and not only in different geographical areas, but in different language areas. Tremendous challenge that had to be dealt with because they were providing information that was delivered as a part of a singular product base. This sounds like it goes without saying, but I think it's appropriate here to mention it, and that is that the providers are not just people who type things. I've never heard anyone say that before, but I've been in many projects, in many meetings, where the system development folks literally treated the providers as if, well, you folks are just essentially keyboard artists who are going to be typing things for us to deliver. It's important that we understand that's not true, and it's very important that we not allow ourselves as system developers to fall into that trap, because the people we're dealing with in many cases won't be technical. They may not be terribly technically sophisticated, but they are the folks who know the things that we need, and so they're not just folks who type things. We need to let them know that we know that. They usually know more about their content than we do. It's important that we understand that these are, for the most part, experts in their field. They may know nothing about ours, but we need to treat them with the respect that they're due for what they were hired to do. They're usually not hired to feed our systems. In some cases they are, and certainly in certain areas, technical documents, for instance, technical writers are usually hired with the foreknowledge that they're going to be creating input for a sophisticated computer system. But there are many other areas, and those areas are growing as the internet and electronic delivery expands. Many groups that never really thought of themselves as folks who were going to be feeding an electronic system. And that, of course, has all kinds of ramifications for how they view what they do, for how they create their data, and for how they respond to the requirements that we put on them. They have their own set of problems, and those problems are typically not ours. As system developers, we face a very rigorous set of challenges, schedules, technology, customer resistance to what we might be putting out, funding, a whole series of things. It's important that we remember that the providers that we work with have their own set. And we need, while we can't solve those for them, and we may actually make them a little worse, we need to give them the respect to know that they're dealing with that set of challenges and that they're going to continue to focus on that while they try to deal with us. Your providers, and I know many of you who've been involved in projects that dealt with provider communities, they can be your best partner or they can be your worst nightmare. And it's important that we understand that to a great extent, whether or they're the former or the latter is up to us. How we deal with them, how we treat them, how we view them, and how we interact with them as they let us know, what their needs and desires are. Well, let's talk about what we want from our providers, because in the end, we're the ones making the changes, and we're going to be going to them to ask for some things. Well, what do we want? The first thing, the most important thing, and I think it's the thing that they will probably have the most trouble with, we want cooperation and discipline. We want their cooperation in the changes that we're going to be making, because we are going to be making changes that in some cases that very significantly will impact their world. And we want, on their part, the discipline to do things as they agree to do them, as we need them, and to do them with the kind of discipline that gives us consistency. Well, that means data with the necessary structure to create our output products. Most of the providers that we're going to be working with will be using WordPerfect or Word or some other word processor. It's important that they understand and that we help them understand that in order to deliver the products electronically, we're going to need a certain amount of structure that they may not be including in what they're doing now. We need data on time. Just like them, in a print world, we're facing schedules perhaps a little looser because we don't have print and bind and delivery schedules for physical books. We still have schedules we have to work with. We need data on time, and we need it not all at the last minute so that we have to deal with it in a panic mode. We need data with a high consistency. Whatever we agree with the providers will be their input. We need that data to be consistent at whatever level they agree to. We need low error rates. The kinds of errors that a provider can make kind of fall into different categories, one of which is things like spelling errors or missing content. Those we can probably correct, but some we can't. Errors of content that we can't even find, and yet the customer will find if we deliver it. We really need to work with the providers, get them to understand that that's a killer, because we have to send things back to them, and that throws the whole cycle into chaos. We need a willingness on their part to embrace and meet our needs, demands, schedules, whatever we put on them. Now, in a few minutes, we'll talk about how we minimize the impact of those, but we really need for them to embrace them, to be willing to meet them, and most of all, not to actively resist them, as so often happens. We need a willingness on their part to trust that we're not out to make ourselves look good at their expense. I've been in a number of projects over the years in which the provider community came in, folded their arms and said, we know what you guys are doing. You're going to build your computer systems and make yourselves look like heroes, and you're going to make us look like dolts, and we don't like it, and by golly, we're not going to do it. And we want their willingness to trust that that's not what we're after, that, well, we may have to look at the system development requirements as our first priority. Their requirements, their needs are, if not just as important, almost as important to us. Well, what do they want from us? As they begin to understand what changes are going to be made and what we're going to want from them, they're going to want some stuff from us. The one thing that they would like most, and they may say this in the first meeting we have with them, is to be left alone to do what they've always done. I mean, they're experts, they're creating input, they're doing research, they're providing products, in some cases electronic, even though at a word processing level, and they'd like to be allowed to continue to do that. If we can't do that, and in most cases we won't be able to, then we want some specific things from them. One of which is they want us to accept their data as close as possible to the way they're comfortable creating it. They only have to make a few changes. Things are probably going to work pretty well. But if we turn their world upside down in terms of how they author, the structures that they have to use, the approach they have to use, the software they have to use, then they're not going to be comfortable with that, and they certainly may be in a position of pushing back, which we want to avoid. They want to know that we're going to work hard to cushion the changes to their procedures and tools, their way of working. Once they understand that there will be changes, it's going to be important to them to know that we're not simply throwing things over the wall to say, hey, deal with it. And I've seen that, and that never works well, and the pushback on that can be very, very strong and very effective. So it's important that we work hard to cushion those changes. We'll talk in a few minutes about how best to do that, but it's important that they know we're prepared to do it. They want us to provide funding for the changes that we may want to make, and in most cases that's not going to happen. But that's going to be important to them, and it's kind of the corollary to that is if we can't fund the changes for them, training, additional people, new software, whatever, it's important for them to know that we will do everything we can to minimize the funding impact on them. That will mostly impact their management, but their management sets the tone for how the actual providers work. And so it's important that that message get through to provider management that we're going to do everything we can to keep their costs down and to pay for everything our budgets will possibly support. We want to make changes to them. They want time to make those changes. And they also want a fallback plan. It's very easy working in the software world where things may take time, but the time is pretty controllable. We design, we develop, we test, we implement. Providers are humans. Their organizations are human, and it takes them more time to change. And of course, the more change we ask of them, the more time it will take. So they want us to give them the time to make those changes, and they want a fallback plan. They don't want, on Monday of a week to be known in the future that they have to change, they have to use new software, write in a different way, and if it doesn't work for them, that they're just out of luck. It's usually quite possible to develop a fallback plan. They're going to want to know what that plan is, and they're going to want to see it as we design it and maybe even test it. Well, in order to get what we need from them and to give them what we can give them and give them the impression and the feeling that where we can't give them what they want, we'll do everything we can to cushion the changes. How do we approach them? Well, number one, start early. Unfortunately, I've seen a number of projects over time where the system developers, because they wanted to get things done, they wanted to get decisions made, said, well, let's get this designed, let's test the software. When we get it to this point, then we'll go on over and we'll work with the providers. That's a mistake, because what that means is that the time that the providers have to understand and make the changes they'll have to make is significantly compressed, and we don't want that, and they won't want it. So it's important that we start early and we start with them early. As a matter of fact, I would suggest that the first time we have a meeting, either at that meeting or in a meeting within a day or so, that provider management and some of the key provider supervision is brought in and made part of the project, so it's developing for them as it's developing for us. It's important that we're transparent. We like to think that there are no strong feelings in organizations, but that's many times not true. And if the provider community thinks that they're being conned, they think their needs are being ignored, they can push back pretty hard. And I've seen a number of projects where the system developers found that when push came to shove and it went to executive management, the providers actually had more power in the organization than they did, and they were sent back to the drawing board to redesign something that they had worked very hard on. So it's important for us to be transparent and for the providers to know what's going on as it's going on, and to have a chance to participate, comment where it's appropriate. They have current methods and tools, which in some cases they've developed. We know that in some cases we're going to be changing those, but we need to respect what they're doing now, even though in some cases those methods won't look terribly logical and will have built up kind of over time, Band-Aid on Band-Aid. We still need to respect that that's what they're doing and to change them only as we need and where we need to change them to give them an alternative that makes as much sense to them as it does to us. We need to plan for minimum impact on their world. They are the most fragile resource in that because they're not automated, they're human. There may be 5 of them, there may be 500, and I've dealt with projects where there were 1,000 authors. We need to impact their world as little as we can, and we need to make sure they know that we're doing that planning so that it's not a matter of we'll do what we want and you guys deal with it. We need to show them strong software support up front for any changes that we're going to make to their procedures and tools. This is a mistake that system developers oftentimes make, especially where a new piece of authoring software is going to have to be implemented. You call the providers in, you select the tool, and I should point out that many times the system developers select that tool, bring the providers in, and show it to them out of the box. Obviously, it's not customized to their needs. There may be a couple of demos in it, but the first thing that happens is the providers go right up the walls, and it can take months for them to come down. And as a matter of fact, I've dealt with a couple of major projects in federal agencies where we were doing things for the second time because the first one crashed and burned because the authors looked at what they were going to have to use and simply said, absolutely not, and the whole system failed. So it's important that we show that strong software. If we do prototypes of authoring tools of whatever they need, and we show those to them up front. Finally, include them in the design effort. There are 2 reasons for that. Number one, it'll reassure them. And it's important that they, as I mentioned earlier, feel that they're an active part of the project and that their ideas and their goals and their needs are going to be considered. And the second one, as you see here, is that they often have some great ideas. I've been involved in authoring design projects where most of the tools that we developed came from ideas that the providers gave us as they sat down to look at what we were doing. They sat, looked at prototypes and said, gee, you know, it might work better if it was this way. And amazingly, we hadn't thought of that. And so it's important that they be involved in the design effort from day one. Now, does that make things a little messier? Yes, it does. These are messy folks in many cases from a computer and automation standpoint. But believe me, they have a contribution to make, and if we deal with them correctly, that will be a very powerful contribution. And lastly, don't assume, and I wouldn't put this in here if I hadn't seen this done over and over, don't assume you can tell them what to do. In many cases, it will be very difficult. In some cases, it's impossible. You can work with them. You can convince them to work with you, to negotiate, to compromise. But I've heard system development managers say, well, they'll do it or we'll get their budget cut or whatever. Never works and usually creates the kind of animosity that can doom a project. Well, you have a number of options. If you go through the initial part, you get people you get your providers on board. Now, what are the options for actually dealing with them? Well, first of all, you can take their content as is and convert and rework it. That's the minimum impact for them because what it says is just keep doing what you're doing. We'll take it and we will prepare it for delivery. But it's the highest cost complexity for you, and it's also a limiter for just how good a product you can deliver electronically because where there isn't appropriate structure in the content, in some cases you can correct that, you can put it in at a cost to you, but in some cases you can't. You won't even see what's not there, and consequently the end product is limited in terms of just how elegant and how usable it can be. This is probably not the thing you would ever want to put on the table as the first option. Now, next, we'll go to the other side. You can change their authoring tools and procedures to fit your needs. This would be something like an XML editor or a database application. It's obviously the best for you because it allows you to design the input you want and then go to the providers and say, here are the tools, this is what you need to give us. But it's the biggest impact on them, and of course, it's going to generate the biggest potential resistance and strengthen their hand in pushing back. And it also, of course, is going to lengthen the project because it'll take time to convince them to do that and to train them to do it and to allow them to come on board. Finally, and I put this last because I think it's probably what happens most, and that's enhance their current authoring environment. Do what you can. If they're using Word, there are things you can do to and with Word to to create more structure in the data, to help them do some things that you need to be done in a very systematic way, but that they may not have been used to doing that way. And it'll also simplify the conversion and minimize the cleanup. Now, this means obviously that you still have to convert their data. Either, you can either bring in your own conversion software, or I think more appropriately work with a firm like DCL to do the conversion, do the cleanup, and then deliver the final product. But by doing this, by enhancing that authoring environment, you will speed up the process, you will make the ultimate product better, and you will cut the time and complexity of the conversion and cleanup. That's terribly important. Moderate impact on them, but favorable to you as well. So that's not only technically a good solution, but it's one that's much easier to sit and discuss with them. Number one, on this slide, you don't want to discuss if you can avoid it. Number two, they won't want to discuss, but you may be able to get to reach a meeting of the minds on this one. Well, what kind of challenges are you facing? Let's put this in graphic terms. Two things we know. We know we need a final product. We know a good bit about what that final product ought to look like, and we know that there's an authoring group or multiple authoring groups somewhere, and we have to somehow get from the one to the other. Now, we'll assume perhaps that you need XML or something like XML, highly structured content. I think that's a pretty good bet. If the authors happen to be using XML now, using XML editors and things like that, even if it isn't the same schema or DTD that you're going to need, it makes things immeasurably easier, and that line between the author and final is going to be pretty much what you see here. Pretty straight line, not a lot of things to be done, maybe a small XSLT conversion at the end, but usually that doesn't happen. And so what we end up doing is putting a conversion step in. What they create is not fully usable, therefore we convert it. As I said, you can do it yourself, but probably better to use a firm. DCL is a good one, to convert the data and create the final output from what the author creates. Well, it would be nice if that were all, but in many cases there's another step in there, and that is that the authors may not be doing things consistently enough to do a good job of conversion, or to do a job of conversion that doesn't have high cost and high complexity. So one of the things that you end up doing in many cases is kind of preparing that authored content. I worked with a legal publisher a number of years ago that had 600 legal authors. It had to hire 200 coders to come in behind those authors, because they simply, these were all independent, attorneys, judges, whatever, and they simply couldn't get them to author their content in a way that would convert properly. So they spent a ton of money, and in some cases, because the preparation people understood the structure, but they didn't understand the content, the subject, there were things that they couldn't fix that just didn't get fixed. So we prepare the data. Hopefully, we can get the authors to discipline themselves so that that's very minimal, or hopefully not do it. We then convert it, but then not everything is going to convert every time correctly. So there's going to be probably some cleanup. Authors who are used to making things look the way they want, using pretty much any structures they want in a word processor, of course the word processor doesn't care, are going to do things kind of all over the map. Some of them will be very good, some of them will be terrible, and some of them, especially the older ones who are not terribly computer savvy, will have trouble improving. So you're going to have some cleanup in there. Obviously, the more structure you can do starting at the left at the authored level, the better job of preparation, the more thoughtful you can be about how you deal with the conversion step itself, the less you're going to have to clean up. But there's probably going to be some in there. So now we've got a situation where you've got several steps that have to be done, and as you can see, it's going to be very important to negotiate every step of that. Negotiate with the authors to get the best product they can give you. Do the preparation very carefully, do a good job of conversion, and then do the minimum cleanup, but be prepared to do it if you need it. And in some cases, especially where you have schedules that have high and low volume, you'll have to have cleanup at a level that you can surge. So if you have lots of data coming in at a certain time, perhaps the end of a legislative session or some other physical deadline, you'll have to do more cleanup in order to get to the deliverable product at the same time. So that's important. You can see it, you can negotiate it. And then there's one more factor that you're going to have to deal with in some cases, and that is, what about revision? Well, you can assume that not everything needs revision. Some things are published, and pretty much that's it. But there are many electronic products that must be revised periodically. In some cases, those revisions are fairly small, and they're just salted in all over the content. Now, you can, as you see here, go back to the author and say, revise the source. But if you do that, you have to go through all the steps of prepare, convert, and clean up again, probably doing that to a lot more data than was changed, because in many cases, the revised data won't be a physical object within the content that you can pull out, update, and then put back again. So, that certainly is the least efficient way of doing it, but it certainly is, in some cases, the only way. You could simplify it a little bit by having the authors or the preparation folks do the revision on the prepared data, the pre-conversion data. You then still have to go through conversion and cleanup on all of that, and that, of course, still requires time, effort, and cost. Finally, you can either have your preparation people, or best case, have your authors revise the converted data. If you're dealing with XML, you have the revisions made using an XML editor. I dealt with a part of the intelligence community a few years back where they had 1,000 analysts who used Word, and that had to be converted and prepared for delivery. But then they got the analysts to agree that when they made a revision, they would go to the production area and would make their revisions to the XML that had been created. Simplified things tremendously and really shortened the time that it took to get a revised product back on the street. And of course, we're talking about battlefield intelligence, so they were under very tight schedules, and that really simplified things. Well, you can take their content, convert it as is. Any content can be converted. Differences in the amount of preparation, cleanup required. Lowest impact, maximum impact on quality and of the resulting content. I would say this: unless you plan to stay with this approach, don't start it. Don't put this one on the table unless you are absolutely pulled by wild horses to do that. Because once it works, even poorly for you, it'll become the provider's method of choice, and it'll be very difficult to get them to come off it because they will know that you can accept it that way and process it. Changing their authoring tools to fit your needs. You're probably using Word or WordPerfect. You don't hear WordPerfect much, but I've dealt with a number of major federal agencies who are still using it, in some cases, for lots of authoring. So it's still around. They're going to want to continue that. You decide to push them to an appropriate authoring tool. They will resist to some extent. Not everyone. There are early adopters who will jump right into it, but I'd say the majority will resist somewhat because they will be giving up not only the tool that they've been using, but they'll be giving up the fact that word processing is an undisciplined process. They really don't like the discipline that structured authoring imposes. And even if you can make Word impose that discipline, they're not going to like that any better than if you use an XML authoring tool. So when you do that, set up an authoring lab where you can show them tools that you're creating for them. It's very important that you do that because you want to make what they're going to use look, feel, and act as much like what they're used to as you can. Obviously, it will be different, but you can give them, if you will, a warm fuzzy that it's not going to be that different, and what they will have to do with it won't be so radically changed that they'll have to start from scratch. Make the editor you choose as comfortable as possible up front. Never show it out of the box first. But boy, this is one you don't want to forget because I've seen the looks on those authors' faces when they saw even ArborText, which is a pretty good-looking editor out of the box. It took months to get them to come back in and take another look at it. And finally, give them time to adapt. Focus on early adopters, get them in, provide a fallback. Worked with a major publisher a few years back who said, tell you what, in about 4 months, we're going to ask you to author 1 document a week in this new editor. And we'll give you a fallback. If it doesn't work or you have trouble with it, we will take it and re-author it for you. And we'd like you to do that for 3 months. Then we'd like you to begin to move into actually authoring. It was amazing how well that worked and how well even the older authors were willing to give that a try, because they knew that if it didn't work for them in that 4-month trial period or 3-month trial period, that someone else would reconvert that article and get it where it needed to get without them having to go back and start from scratch. Well, let's talk about the last option, enhancing their environment, simplify conversion. Even word processing can be disciplined. In the intelligence example that I mentioned a minute ago, they had 1,000 analysts who used Word. We're going to continue using Word, and had the clout to say, no, we're not going to go to an XML author in system, even though the Department of Defense had said you must produce XML by a certain date. And so the production folks in this agency worked very hard to build tools that ran on top of Word that made it easier for the author to create the data, to structure the data, and made it easier to convert. Authoring applications can simplify complex structures. They can validate input. They can impose value lists, all kinds of things. It just takes the ability to get in with the provider, find out the challenges that they're facing in giving you what you want, and then build tools to do it. These are not complex tools. Most of them are in a simple scripting language, and they'll run right on top of Word. Select your conversion method early, so you know how close you must be to convert successfully. In other words, if you're going to structure their environment, don't put yourself in a position where you have to structure it more than is necessary. Figure out what you need, what you can convert, working with your conversion house, and only impose the changes on that authoring environment that you need. And then finally, work with providers to encourage them to make revisions in the final form. As I mentioned, that will so immeasurably simplify what you have to do. It will also simplify what they have to do, because they won't be worrying about you reconverting large amounts of their data for a small number of changes. So what about revisions? If the output changes after publication, you must revise. If you've converted the source, what do you revise? The original, the pre-conversion form after it's been prepared, or convince the authors to revise in final form. Now, you could support this by having certain kinds of revisions made by your staff. It depends a lot on the mix of revisions, on where they are and how much they are, how much thought goes into them. But that's an area where you can convince them to come toward you while you go toward them a little bit and take a little of that just the hours load off them in making those revisions in an editor, an XML editor or a database application that they won't be fully familiar with. Well, conclusions. It's seldom a matter of black and white, either or. It's finding the right shade of gray, getting the balance with your providers that puts minimum changes on them, but still gives you what you need at a cost that your budgets and their budgets can support. You'll do best if you understand each portion, function, and participant going in. Don't just design the system and then go talk to the authors. Not only will they not like it, but you probably will not have designed a system that is optimum for what the entire content lifecycle needs to look like. Starting right and including every participant will insulate you to a great extent from mutiny by the authors. And mutiny in an authoring environment is not a pretty thing. They can really fold their arms and say, we're not doing it. And in some cases, they'll have the power to make that stick. Keep your wits about you. This can be complex. It can be, as I mentioned, authors can be messy. They can be not all that easy to deal with in some cases. We're all human. But if you keep your wits about you, be willing to work with them, get help where you need it. You may need a consultant who really understands authoring systems to come in. If you're working with a firm like DCL, they have some services folks who can come in and help you understand the balance between what you give to conversion and what comes out of conversion, and how to minimize the cost and complexity of that. Tread carefully. Don't make any rash assumptions about what you can do, what you can tell the authors to do. You're likely to be successful. It won't be black and white, but it'll work, and it will get the job done, and it will get better over time. I think we have some time for questions, Adam.
Yes, we do, Barry, and thank you very much for this. This was very informative indeed. We do have several questions that have already come in, and the first one is, you have told us to involve providers early. Just how early should we approach them, and what role should they take in the early going?
Well, I think that's a good question, and I guess the way I see it is the beginning of everything is when an executive decision is made to change something. Usually that comes down from some level above. We need to change a product. We're going to field a new product. We're going to subdivide products. As soon as that decision is made is the time, I think, to involve the providers, and that is first meeting. Provider management should be there. Usually it makes sense for executive management to talk to both providers and system developers and say, here's what we're going to do. It's going to be a challenge, but we're going to work with both of you, and we're going to make sure that we do it as well as we possibly can. And that will make both system development folks and provider folks feel like they have an ownership to the system, and that starts a process that can be very positive as you move forward together. So when we talk about early, we mean, I think, very, very early. You won't even know at that point a lot of the questions and answers. You can learn those together and help each other to come up with answers that are best for the overall project.
Thank you, Barry. The next question is, my experience with authors and XML is that they resist aggressively. Can we really hope to get them to use an XML editor?
Well, there's probably not a single answer to that. Certainly it's possible in some cases that you can't. But I think there are two things to remember. Number one, the authors are going to have to make some changes. You're going to try to minimize those changes. And in some cases, the minimum change will be using a structured editor, an XML editor, or a database application that imposes some structure. What I've found over the years is that authors oftentimes say, we use Word and we don't want to give it up. But what's really true is it's not so much Word they want to give up, or they don't want to give up. It's the discipline that they do not want to have imposed on. In Word, you can make things look pretty much any way you want. In many authoring environments, there's no template. They can use normal for almost everything and simply make things bold or centered or whatever they like. That's acceptable, and they get very used to that. And the minute you come in and say, this is a heading, this is a subheading, you can only have one paragraph after that, it doesn't, to some extent, matter how you do that. They're not going to like it. Now, in some cases, the fact that you've laid an XML editor on the table means that it gets blamed for that. But I think the key is that they're not going to like the discipline. There are, for instance, some Word add-ons that try to make Word literally act like an XML editor. And my experience with authors using those is they don't like those any better, even though they look like Word and pretty much act like Word. That discipline is just not fun until an author gets used to it. So the answer is, in some cases you won't be able to, but in most cases, if you approach it carefully and you let the authors know that you can build customizations into that editor that will make much of what they do simpler, you have a fair chance of getting to do it if you give them some time to get used to it and to adopt it on their own.
Well, thank you, Barry. We really appreciate that. Thank you, everyone, for attending. This concludes today's broadcast. You can access the recorded version of this webinar in the archive section of dclab.com. Our next webinar will be this upcoming Wednesday, May 6th at 1 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. The webinar is titled Your Brain on XML and is presented by Val Switcher, founder and CEO of Content Rules. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.